So I'm doing New Zealand. So for those who don't know, it's off the coast of 5 million people. With New York City, it's a
Your
little
audio
here.
is lagging.
So I was interested in learning about their approach because it is? Okay, well, I was interested in their approach because their early successes. So I want to know why they so they started off with some initial advantages. New Zealand is a predominantly self-sufficient economy where a lot of the goods and services that are used in the country are produced within the country. So things like food and fuel are made in the country, while things that are not as necessary, more wants than needs, like iPhones, are made outside the country. So that gives the government more of a leeway when trying to figure out which things to close and which things to open. They also have geographic isolation from other countries. So whereas in the United States, you have the Alaska loophole where people can get into Canada and spread the disease that way by saying, oh, I'm just going to Alaska. You don't really have that in New Zealand, which is separate from everything else. So New Zealand did a few things differently. So first with their timeline, they banned foreigners and other people from entering the country long before there were cases. They also had they started off with daily briefings and communicating with the citizens of the country early on to explain what's going on, how the government is handling the pandemic overall. And they also simplified the contact tracing operations that the country had in place. But one thing that they did do differently that they probably should not have done was become complacent and reopened before everything was taken care of. But the thing that stood out to me the most about New Zealand's approach was that they balanced mitigation and elimination. So rather than trying to prevent the disease from entering the country, they focused their effort on eliminating it within the country. So rather than trying to control who comes in and how they come in and manage that, they just decided we should just focus on making sure that our citizens don't have it at all. And it's not here, rather than preventing it from getting in. So looking at their timeline, they started banning people from entering the country just very early on, before they had their first case. And throughout the summer, this strategy did work well for them in that they were able to bring down the number of cases that they had initially. While they did still get cases later on from naturally born New Zealand residents who were able to come into the country, they were able to have overall to the point where they were able to have 0 cases for several straight days and 0 community transmission amongst the people who lived in the country. However, this didn't totally work out when later in August 11th, they did have a new case, which they suspect came in through freight, but they're still not really sure how that got into the country. And just to visualize the chart of their cases, while they did have 1 or 2 people initially start off with, or 1 or 2 initial New Zealand residents get the COVID disease, which spread throughout the community, they were able to flatten this infection curve until late August, where it started to peak again. So one thing that did stand out to me about New Zealand's approach was their emphasis on scientific communication. So their prime minister took to Facebook Live and had daily briefings to explain in both a cohesive and simplified manner how they were trying to mitigate the spread of the virus. And watching through these, one thing that really did just strike me was how these briefings were not just for the adults, but they were also geared towards people who might not understand what a pandemic is. So she did talk about how the Easter Bunny was an essential worker and why the Easter Bunny might not be coming around, and how they had to take a 20% cut. But putting it in the context of people who might not be able to understand otherwise. I also noticed how they communicated the reasoning for the lockdown and why they wanted to shut things down so early. So the scientific reports and the models that they had commissioned from local universities, they made available on the Ministry of Health's website, which is still available for download and still easily viewable, to see how things could get worse if they did not take immediate action, but also convey that to everyone that this can get worse and let everyone decide or make their own opinion on how things could get worse based on this available data. Another thing that they did well was using a 4-level alert system. So this is based on the alert system that they have for wildfires, but they just retargeted it for COVID, where each level represents a different set of restrictions, but also a different sense of how the pandemic is progressing, ranging from reopen all the schools, hang out at movie theaters, to lockdown, stay at home, only essential workers can come out. Another thing that they did well was the COVID Tracer app that the Ministry of Health distributed. So this allowed users to scan a QR code that was put up at an industry, at an organization or business, and allowed the user to have a digital diary of each place that they visited, so that if a contact tracer did get in touch with them, they'd be able to say, this is where I've been, and even write down who they were with so that they could contact those other people also. And this was not totally mandatory. It was voluntary, where a user would be able to download the app and put down either their email or their NHI number, which is their, I guess, health insurance number, to contact trace them later. So the main takeaways from this was that clear communication and informative decision-making was a strong way for New Zealand to move through this, being able to explain why they were making certain decisions, and having this kind of informed consent to the public of, this is why we're going to do this. Also embracing scientific modeling, so using the models that were available to them to make these decisions in the first place, and commissioning these to begin with, definitely was an advantage. But also a takeaway was the negative of reopening too early allowed this resurgence to happen again later in the summer. These are my sources, and that is it.
Thank you, New Zealand. Any question?
So you said a couple of times that you think they opened too early. If New Zealand opened too early, how would you characterize like how fast America reopened or Europe reopened?
Yeah, well, New Zealand didn't have any cases when they reopened, and they still had a resurgence. So America reopening when they still have many cases doesn't make a lot of sense, and is definitely far more problematic.
One question I have is, can you think of any other country which is similar to New Zealand in terms of geographical isolation, but didn't do as well as New Zealand?
Mm-hmm. I would say Australia's situation is pretty similar, but that's still in Oceania. So, nothing immediately
UK
jumps
is an
out.
island, right?
I know that New York also had a similar strategy, but they were also. Oh, sorry.
UK is an island, right?
UK is an island. Yeah,
but not as isolated as New Zealand. The reason I'm asking, because is it because of the location, or is it because of the clear communication? Which one is it, or is it both?
I would definitely say both had a hand in it. I would say that clear communication did have or did provide a strong foothold to get the citizens of New Zealand on board with the lockdown, and In fact, there's a study after that which showed that 86% of the citizens of New Zealand supported their government and their actions in the future surrounding the pandemic. So that definitely helps on one front, but on the other front of people who are not in the country, being isolated allow them to mitigate cases that way. So preventing new cases from coming in, isolation helps, and then reducing the cases that they have now, clear communication helps.
I would argue that while it's not a country, a geographic area that says isolated that has not done as well as Hawaii. So
we'll learn more next class.
Exploring that, yeah, next week.
All right, let's move on to India.